Rebel base in range.
You may fire when ready.
Commence primary ignition.
I think, first of all, the thing that we really aspire to constantly is quality.
Attack me with all your strength.
The best parts about Star Wars is there is no good or evil. It depends on what side you're standing on, truly. You know what I mean?
What?
Well, I think it's the storytelling is so primal. It's good versus evil, and it's very clear even to the youngest viewer.
It's good against evil. It's George's homage to every film that he ever loved. George loves films, and that's what this film is about, is movies.
When I saw Frozen as a grown-ass woman, I cried through the entire movie. There was just something about the relationship between the sisters, the like de-villainization of the classic kind of fairy tale bad guy, you know, the concept of true love being between two sisters and not a heterosexual relationship. Like, it just destroyed me completely.
What happens is no matter how you do it, when you sit down to write something, all of the influences you've had in your life come into play. The things that you like, the things that you've seen, the observations you made, that's ultimately what you work with when you're writing.
She's a powerful leader. Yes. In a very woman-centered world, which I was very excited to kind of be in that, because I feel like Star Wars is very like patriarchal, so it was kind of cool to have like this sort of woman-centered figure.
Well, what appealed to me was that George Lucas, who wrote it and also directed it, didn't want a damsel in distress, didn't want your stereotypical princess, you know, sort of a victim, frightened, incapable of dealing with the situation without the guys. So he wanted a fighter. He wanted someone who was independent, and that's what appealed to me about that part, yeah.
And when Carrie came in, she was that character. She was very strong, very smart, very funny, very bold, very tough. You know, there really wasn't much of a question. There are not very many like her. You know, they're 1 in a billion.
What was so wild about this show and my experience coming onto it was Leslie and Lucasfilm had already developed the show around me before I even had my first meeting.
Curious.
I thought, well, where most mythology takes place in a distant place. So I said, well, the only place that's left really is outer space. I mean, it's the only place where we don't know what's there. And where it can be magical.
You know, these actually female-driven warrior films where the fights are, for lack of a better term, musical numbers. I mean, you know, like they're a way to physicalize how everyone feels. So really the fight sequences and the action in our show is just another aspect of the characters externalizing what they're going through emotionally. So Frozen and Kill Bill have a lot in common. I'm just trying to explain.
One of the reasons why I made Star Wars is it's made for 12-year-olds. It appeals to everybody, but it was still made for 12-year-olds.
We were all 12 once.
And I tell people, don't underestimate 12-year-olds. They're smarter than the rest of us.
Right.
They get stuff much faster than you do.
Yeah.
But if you can't look and see that Anakin blowing up the Death Star possibly killed millions and millions of people.
Idiots! Star Wars is always about rebels versus institutional threat, right? Underdogs versus huge empire, right?
You know, the psychology of developing fantasies is a very interesting and delicate thing. I've come across people that have no imaginations at all.
So if we said it then the Jedi become the antagonists, not the bad guys, but they become the bad guys to the bad guys.
Well, I was shocked the first time I came across it, and because I just assumed everybody had an imagination.
And I gotta say, Kathy really responded to that. She really felt like that was a pocket of the universe that we had not seen, that nobody else had pitched her.
And it is interesting because I have a huge number of men who call me constantly and tell me how much of a Star Wars fan they are and how much they want to get involved in anything to do with Star Wars. I don't have a lot of women who call and have those conversations with me.
In the beginning, you hire somebody because of their work.
That everyone is sitting in there waiting for George Lucas and not for the person who's going to know to hire Ralph McQuarrie. That's the problem.
I'd seen some of his paintings and I thought he was really brilliant. I had said, look, I want you to do some paintings of these scenes that I've done so that the studio can get a picture of what it is I'm talking about. And met him. He was a very sweet guy, easy to get along with. And with the combination of those things, I said, let's go.
Well, Anakin just killed a whole Death Star. How many people died on that?
What? I've made movies with very young people that have no track record. So I have to kind of go through and discover them, pick them, and then test them and go through them and have readings. And so it takes a long time. I spent probably 6 or 7 months casting Star Wars, and that's a long process of sit in a little room and interview people. And I interviewed thousands of people.
I had I had one idea for every role, and I got every single person. There was no casting process. I wanted Amandla, I wanted JJ, I wanted Manny especially. I was like, I have no other ideas, so it's got to be Manny Jacinto.
All too easy. I'd taken the proposal to a couple of studios, and they had turned it down, completely confused by it. Robots and Wookiees, they couldn't read it and say, I understand what this is all about. Science fiction was not something that did well at the box office. On top of that, it was aimed at young people, and most of the studios said, look, Disney does that. The rest of us can't do that.
That's the misogyny and the problem with the auteur myth as it stands today, because they're not thinking this is the person that will hire the right people, and this is the person that will be able to create the lookbooks and direct people to get them to that place. They're just thinking, do you have all the answers? And the truth is that nobody does, and anybody that says they do is lying.
The Star Wars saga is his baby, and he knows it better than anybody else knows it.
I worried about the fact that I'd never been behind a camera. I had no idea how to put a crew together. I didn't know anything about filmmaking, but I just said yes.
I mean, it took me years to get my first film off the ground, and as I talk to film students now, especially, I say the easiest job you'll ever get is to try to make your first film, because that's the easy one to get, is the first film, because nobody knows whether you can make a film or not.
And I really, if there anytime young filmmakers, especially young women, ask me, if I want to become a filmmaker, what do I do?
Gods, leave us.
I'm always like, when that happens, say yes. Don't say, I don't know how to make a movie, because men don't say that.
I didn't know anything about making movies. I was an anthropology major and was interested in photography, was interested in going to art school, but my father wouldn't have anything to do with it. So I figured there would be some photography in the School of Cinematography, which is what it was, School of Cinema. And I didn't even realize you could go to school to learn how to make movies.
Dudes roll out of film school, throw on a Spielberg hat, and go, I know everything that I'm doing.
Worked 3-4 years to get from my first film to my second film, of banging on doors, trying to get people to give me a chance, writing, struggling with no money in the bank, working as an editor on the side, working as a cameraman on the side, getting little jobs, eking out a living, trying to stay alive.
Even the truth is, we are so spoiled now with Star Wars media.
And when we started the first film, I investigated all of the optical houses and special effects people and realized there was nobody around and no company around that could really do things that I wanted to do in that picture. So I realized that I was going to have to start a company and put together a whole group of people that would just be specifically for making Star Wars.
And the reality is that you can do it. You just have to have the confidence to walk in there and pretend like you know how to do it.
First 2 weeks of shooting, we'd run into a lot of weather problems. The sets had blown down. I didn't get everything shot. It was a disaster. At that point, I was pretty depressed, saying, boy, I've got myself in way over my head. I don't know what I'm going to do.
I'm telling you guys, the truth. That's how I made my first film, was that I was like, I know what's going on. I didn't at all. And I think it shows in the movie.
Dear idea.
Up on my way home, flying from LA to San Francisco, thinking, oh my God, this isn't going to work. This is a mess. And you'll never get to work again. And I was having severe chest pains. They took me to the hospital because they thought I might be having a heart attack. They said, have you been under a lot of pressure? I said, yeah. They said, well, that's probably that. take some aspirin, call us in the morning. But of course, everybody else was panicked. What if I died? People don't even know what the movie is.
But I got to make my first one, which helped me to make my second one. And the second one will help me make the third one. And then I stopped because they won't let women make more than 3.
Leslie was incredible, and she is incredible at this in every one of her projects, at collaborating with the people that are involved. At least, and I can only speak from our aspect, but such a brilliant job at bringing us on and allowing us to find our own voices and our own connections to the characters, which I just think breathes life into a performance in a very specific and detailed way.
Like, take credit, but like stand on their shoulders.
I think George likes people. I think George is a warm-hearted person, but he's a little impatient with the process of acting, of finding something, and he thinks it's there. It's right there. I wrote it down, Just do that. Sometimes you can't just do that and make it work.
Doesn't lock, doesn't lock, does it?
The reality is that Star Wars in and of itself is not just a vast universe full of many different characters, many different eras, but it is always about the spiritual journey of what it is to become who you are.
When you've seen a picture, it connects with you in a particular kind of way. A good novel operates, again, you have this little voice going on, you're saying, this has something to do with me in my life. Art is a very human thing because it relates, I think, to the issues of beauty, and not just visual beauty, but intellectual beauty.
You really don't need to know anything to watch our show. So I hope that it will excite Star Wars fans and feel faithful to what already exists. But I also hope that it invites new fans and indoctrinates them into what I love.
Yeah, I basically set out to make a modern fairy tale. And
good guys, bad guys.
Yeah.
And teach you how to live.
And it's not a teaching as much as it is you get a sense of it rather than a direct, thou shalt not. It's much more of a, I don't think I will.
Like, yes, I'm brutal. Yes, I just did something unforgivable, but you brought her here. You recruit children and you train them and you bring them into situations that they shouldn't be in. And now you're mad at me? Just putting it out there that possibly. So he ended up being essentially very anti-establishment, which is obviously what the rebels are and the resistance is in Star Wars normally. But once I locked into like, oh right, he's the voice of the counterculture of this era.
Because I think the core issues that I'm dealing with are, if they were valid 2,000 years ago, they've got to still be valid today, even though they're not in fashion.
Why are they out of fashion?
Because I think it's harder. The world we live in is more complex, and I think that a lot of those moralities have gotten to be grayed to the point where they don't exist anymore.
You have to understand that the Jedi are not the Jedi that they are in the prequels. They're not the Jedi that they are, pre and post Battle of Yavin. Like they're in a different space where they're operating with less oversight, number one, and they're also operating with, I think, a little more hubris. Like, of course, we're doing the right thing. We're doing the right thing. This is how we've always done it, and that's the right thing.
But those issues are still there in most people's minds. The importance of, say, friendship and loyalty. Most people look at that and say, how corny. But, the issues of friendship and loyalty are very, very important to the way we live our lives. But it's not common knowledge among young people. They're still learning. They're still picking up ideas. They're still using these ideas to shape the way they're going to conduct their life. And you need to tell the same story over and over again every generation so that generation gets it. And I think we've gone for a few generations where a lot of the sort of more basic stories have fallen by the wayside.
What we understand to be Star Wars, like the idea that like that only came from George Lucas, that only George Lucas holds the key for what we understand to be Star Wars is just untrue. And I think the prequels are an excellent example of that.
The main thing is to protect these characters, make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them, and that the universe of Star Wars continues to grow. You could actually blog about what we're doing and how we're messing things up.
No. Hopefully it'll be an inspiring package of entertainment that it has always been well into the future.
And then here you come. And you did it. You did it. You understood the assignment.
I can't watch anymore.
G'day. So, The Acolyte. I really don't think I've seen a finer example of all the problems with Disney Star Wars so neatly encaptured before. Honestly, it's actually impressive how perfect the show is in terms of the discussion points that I want to hit. An ideal case study into everything wrong with the franchise and modern Hollywood holistically. I know, I'm as surprised as you, but as it turns out, Disney Star Wars apathy has not yet overcome me in its entirety. While I genuinely believed that I could no longer care any less about Disney Star Wars, particularly after the absolute rock show that was Ahsoka and its tactical neutering of the EU's poster child in Grand Admiral Thrawn, but The Acolyte has sparked something within me. Perhaps it's the way it seeks to overtly deconstruct the Jedi Order, in a time when the Western world desperately needs some classical mythological good to believe in. Perhaps it's the homages that are so blatant I struggle not to call them plagiarism. Perhaps it's the scorched earth approach the fandom has adopted to discussing Star Wars, leaving no middle ground in an ever-growing culture war of extreme polar opposites. Perhaps it's the fact that The Acolyte is literal fan service greenlit by a studio that has never understood the core Star Wars narrative or its cultural significance, and continues to dilute Star Wars' very essence with more and more mediocrity. Or perhaps it's because the lessons that were so central to the original 6 films, about being a part of something bigger than yourself, the importance of friendship, standing up to bullies, and realising that no one soul is ever beyond saving, have been foregone in favour of whatever contemporary hang-up the chosen writer has. Regardless, I appreciate George Lucas more and more every day, so I'm back to sprinkle a little bit of salty criticism on The Acolyte. Before I begin in earnest, I best address one of the larger blue elephants in the room. One might think it would be next to impossible to discuss Disney Star Wars without entering into the great woke debate. I, however, subscribe to a different philosophy.
This is attractive, that is not. Well, that is all behind me. I now do what other people only dream. I am the world's first fully functioning homicidal artist. I make art until someone dies.
I do think there's validity in discussing the progressive versus traditionalist approaches to Star Wars, because, funnily enough, they align rather neatly with the goals of modern Lucasfilm when compared to the vision of George Lucas. But pigeonholing that criticism under the big woke banner because of superficial observations really lacks the nuance I seek in my criticism. That said, my personal metric for new Star Wars entertainment hasn't changed. To be considered a fine addition, it needs to be consistent with the works of George Lucas, and in this case that includes the prequels. It needs to enhance the Star Wars mythos without causing confusion or detracting from it, i.e. is the story worth telling, or is it just more of the same? And 3, being most important of all, it cannot cause irreparable damage to Lucas's lore and characters, although I really do feel like that ship has sailed at this point. On the following dive, we'll do a surface level recap of the series, discussing its good and bad elements, because believe it or not, there are actually some redeeming qualities to be found, and we'll also take a look at the general criticisms as well as a couple that I had personally. And we'll take a closer look at the showrunner and their relationship to Star Wars, because in the case of The Acolyte, it is impossible to separate the artist from the art. I use those terms magnanimously, if not very loosely. To scope the discussion, I'll be limiting the lore talks to the original works of George Lucas, i.e. the prequels and original trilogy, because if I start talking about the extended universe, we'll be here all bloody day. Be warned, the currents ahead are salty and oppressive, so I would encourage you to check your hull integrity and pressure gauges before we continue.
Here we go again.
Did you ever hear the tragedy?
In the event that anyone cares, I'm about to recap the Acolyte's plot, which includes spoilers. That should be a fair indicator about what I think the show's merits are personally, but as they say, there are two types of people. Those that can extrapolate from incomplete data. The story takes place 100 years before the events of The Phantom Menace and towards the end of the Star Wars High Republic era. Separated into two timelines of present and flashback, the plot centres on two Force-sensitive twins, May and Osha, whom are the product of immaculate Force conception between two mothers.
What?
From the outset, this premise is very problematic in terms of the core Star Wars narrative, being the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, but we'll talk more about that later. The twin mothers are witches in a coven of women that understand the Force as the thread that ties all living things together. Sounds familiar? Because their views are different from the Jedi, they perceive themselves as outcasts that have no place in the galaxy, despite the show not really demonstrating this any further than a couple of lines of dialogue.
The galaxy is not a place that welcomes women like us, witches who have the abilities we do. I told you this planet would be safe haven for our coven.
I mean, hiding in a giant fortress atop a mountain on a planet that is already home to the Jedi seems like a pretty poor way to hide, but I digress. It doesn't take long for the Force-sensitive twins to become known to the Jedi, whom in turn attempt to recruit them to their Jedi Order. The witch mothers are isolate by nature and thus do not wish the Jedi to take the girls, going as far as to use their dark magic to deter them. However, Osha decides that she wants to become a Jedi, rather than a witch. Again, I'm not sure how she learned about the Jedi, given their mother's overprotective nature and views on the Jedi, the Coven collectively's views on the galaxy, and their ultimate desire to remain isolate, but whatever. This naturally causes conflict with her sister, which leads to an accident involving fire that sees the entire Coven killed, the girls separated, and Osha taken into the care of the Jedi. Or does it? See, as it turns out, this was only one side of the story, with the full truth coming to light towards the end of the season. Oh no, as it turns out the Jedi were the baddies all along. Whomever could have predicted this? Using this as justification in the present, May seeks revenge on the Jedi for destroying the Coven, murdering several Jedi, for which Osha is initially mistakenly identified and arrested, whom at this point in the story is no longer part of the Jedi Order. This lasts for about half an episode before it's revealed that May is responsible and not Osha, which was kind of a weird plot choice, as it could have led to something of a significant shock. But hey, that's the direction the writers decided to go with. It is soon revealed that May has been trained in the ways of the Force by a black-clad knight wielding a red lightsaber, whom is definitely not a Sith.
But a Jedi like you might call me Sith.
Well shit, that causes massive timeline problems as well. But I guess we'll get to that too. The Sith is revealed, he kills more Jedi in what's probably the first decent lightsaber duel we've seen since the prequels, and amongst the confusion, May and Osha switch places, for some reason. The season comes to its inevitable climax where it all started. The Sith and Master Sol do battle, as do the twins, with Osha finally realising that it was Sol that killed her mother. I saw this as an act of self-defense, but apparently the show doesn't discriminate. In a moment of rage, she bleeds a Kyber crystal and then kills her former master. The twins escape before realising that they can't outrun the Jedi forever, and the Sith mind wipes May, because apparently that's a thing you can do now. May is taken into the custody of the Jedi, and Osha runs away with the Sith. The Jedi then do their best to cover everything up, rather than applying any logic to the situation at all, and the show ends with a character cameo that deserves far better than being associated with this story. The show has issues at all levels, from the cosmetic and superficial to the broader philosophic and esoteric. But if I was being generous, I would say the production value has cleared the very low bar of Kenobi and Boba Fett, and and is on par with Ahsoka. It doesn't get close to Andor's production value, despite the efforts that have been made with physical sound stages and on-location shooting, but it is clear that an effort has been made to steer away from the limitations of the 3D rendered environments of the volume. Performances range from very good to very, very bad, fight choreography is very similar, and the script is something that I can only define as schizophrenic, as character motivations spin on a dime depending on what the writer wants to say at any given moment. Things like a by-the-book Jedi Master wanting to report something to the Jedi Council, only to then decide to cover it up because it's more convenient. Things like May spending her entire adult life away from the Republic and the Jedi, actively seeking the highest order of revenge for those who killed her mother, only to then decide that Sol should face the High Council's justice and return to Coruscant, rather than killing him in place. The script very much feels like the showrunner had the end goal in mind, but had no idea how to drive the plot there organically, meaning that decisions, payoffs, and resolutions come from absolutely nowhere and do not feel earned. As I've said in the past, I can be fairly forgiving of a project when I see that there is genuine passion that has gone into it. We'll discuss Leslie Headland in more detail later, but for the most part, I do think she's a Star Wars fan at heart who got in over her head and didn't fully consider the ramifications of what her show was doing, at least in terms of the wider canon. That doesn't excuse any of the creative decisions that have been made, might I add, and there may very well be a little bit of malice underlying it all too, but I'll let you be the judge of that in due course. While The Acolyte is quite literally corporately produced fan fiction,
I did do a couple of RPG campaigns during COVID with my friends on Zoom, and there are a couple of characters from those campaigns that may or may not be in the show, so
I believe an attempt has been made, however poorly, to address some of the widely accepted criticisms of Disney Star Wars. Allow me to explain.
Do or do not. There is no try.
Outside of my own personal criticisms that we'll get into shortly, there have been a few widely accepted problematic trends with Disney Star Wars, particularly in the streaming shows, that fans have taken issue with and agreed upon, at least broadly speaking. Firstly, the inconsistent and often convenient Force powers that seem to fluctuate depending on the requirements of the plot, rather than remaining consistent to the character. You know, things like Rey's overpowered Force abilities in The Force Awakens, Kenobi's rock slide ability that rivaled Emperor Palpatine's Senate Surf, Sabine's zero to hero Force push, and pretty much the entirety of Force powers in The Rise of Skywalker. Under Disney, the Force very much seems to be a get out of jail free card rather than an ability that takes a great deal of discipline and concentration to master that remains consistent across the original films. I was actually shocked when Osha found herself in a bind and attempted to use the Force after many years of no training, and she actually failed. It's a small moment, and it's outshined by a lot of other problems, but it was a surprise.
To be sure, but a welcome one.
The second, as I've alluded to already, is the overuse of the rendered environments of the volume, which became evident from Boba onwards. The physical limitations of the set size, reliance on CGI rendered backgrounds, with little physical sets to break it up, led to shows like Kenobi looking cheap and rushed when compared to Mando's Season 1 and 2. While less obvious in Ahsoka, Andor really highlighted the difference in terms of scope and credibility with its use of excellent physical sets and sound stages, as well as on-location shooting. The Acolyte has attempted to replicate the same, but falls well short of Andor in most instances. For me at least, it's the little things that give the game away. Spray-painted Bunnings boxes, jungle stages that look like something from George of the Jungle, and caves from the Power Rangers movie, as well as how new and clean everything looks, which really doesn't compare to the grounded reality of the used future aesthetic that was the pride of George Lucas's films. I know, The Acolyte is set during the High Republic era, when the galaxy was arguably at its cleanest, but when comparing these scenes to the prequels, it's hard to deny that the art and props departments really didn't earn their money here. I mean, really, the costumes look like they've literally come straight out of the plastic and have never been worn before. Again, it's a small thing, but the small things add up quickly, and attention to detail was a defining principle of the original films. Was it a question of money?
Like, this is Star Wars.
Yes, they practically built so much of it. It's not, on the volume. It is built, and so we really are in the world. It's really very cool.
Huge hand-painted backdrops. Like, it's insane.
And on location as well, of course.
Money, a lot of money.
Listen, we like high production values over here.
Well, based on what I've seen, I don't think so, but I'll let you be the judge of that. The third, and probably the one you've all been waiting for, is the whole lightsabers not killing people when stabbed routine. It's become almost a comical cliche the number of times a key character has been injured in Disney Star Wars with a lightsaber only to walk it off. This extends further than lightsabers really, as it seems Disney has an aversion to killing off any of their characters. Well, except for the key heroes from the original trilogy, and the poor, poor stormtroopers. So again, imagine my surprise when in episode 5, not only does the Sith kill several Jedi with his lightsaber and they all stay dead, but he actually kills off 2 characters that have been part of the show since the first episode of the season. Arguably key characters. Outstanding move. This one scene is probably the most accurate depiction of saber combat we've seen under Disney's tenure, and although it's ruined by terrible dialogue, worst pacing, and a bullshit conclusion, I'll tip my tentacle to the actual fight scene. Also, props for the use of cortosis for the first time in live action as well. I'm sure that made many a keen-eyed EU fan very happy. All 3 of these factors feel like a reaction by the creators of The Acolyte to address some of the widely expressed concerns plaguing Disney Star Wars. And while they're not enough to drag The Acolyte out of the pit of mediocrity in which it finds itself, I appreciate the effort all the same.
Don't get all mushy on me. So long, princess.
Moving into some of my own personal and general Disney Star Wars critiques, let's talk about dialogue. There is a widely held view that Star Wars dialogue has always been a bit, how you going?
Not impossible. I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home. They're not much bigger than T-meters.
And that's not just an opinion held by fans, but many of the actors as well.
Then I started reading, and it seemed to me the dialogue was pretty ropey.
I did tell George one time that you could type this shit, but you couldn't say it.
And my line was, but we can't turn back. Fear is their greatest defense. I doubt if the actual security there is any greater than it was on Aquilai or Soas, and what there is most likely directed towards a large-scale assault. And I thought, who talks like this, George?
I'm not going to argue the point, because George Lucas has openly admitted in the past that he's not the best writer getting around.
I am not the greatest writer in the world.
And the Star Wars films, inclusive of the prequels, are more than the sum of their parts, only one of which is their ropey dialogue. That said, if this is considered a mark against Lucas's work, then one would think that current creators would seek to improve upon the past, rather than replicate or compound it. Sadly, The Acolyte's dialogue is not an improvement, and it's arguably some of the worst the franchise has ever seen. A combination of ye old pretentious speak, common earth colloquialisms, and downright cringe. While I can get past the ye old pretentious speak, and I'd be a bit naive to think that cringe dialogue hasn't always existed in Star Wars, but the common earth expressions and vernacular is just something I can't get past. For me, it's absolutely immersion breaking. I'm certainly not saying that this is the first time occurring, particularly in regards to common earth colloquialisms that were rampant in The Last Jedi.
Godspeed, rebels.
But I do think it's interesting that people will readily use poor dialogue as an attack vector on the prequels, yet happily use it as a point of franchise consistency when defending Disney Star Wars.
That is one big pile of shit.
Speaking of consistency, plagiarism. It's about the only thing I can confidently say that I trust Disney Star Wars to deliver. Not just in terms of the conceptual designs that we'll talk about shortly, but also in terms of shots, scenes, characters, and pretty much everything else. But a picture paints 1,000 words, so let's take a look at some examples.
Don't center on your anxieties, Obi-Wan. Keep your concentration here and now where it belongs.
Calm yourself, Padawan. Do not center around your anxieties.
He was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil.
Pupil of mine. Before he turned to evil.
You and I will be working much more closely.
An acolyte kills the dream.
And that's just them stealing from themselves.
More? More did you speak?
but you get the idea. It's almost like they're incapable of creating anything new. On that note, let's talk about production design. Lucasfilm seems to have two methodologies when it comes to design. Either to bastardize previously unused concept art, or create something new that is very contemporary and generic by pre-existing standards. As a result, a lot of their new designs look like they've come straight out of the Unreal Engine store. If I was to offer some conjecture, I would say that the distinct lack of uniqueness in the designs when compared to the works of Macquarie, Johnson and Doug Chan, despite the latter still being employed at Lucasfilm as a senior design director, is part budgetary and part time constraint, which I find hard to justify given the proof of concept seen in The Mandalorian. But primarily, I believe it's because without George Lucas, Star Wars has lacked a clear and unified vision that could steer the creative potential of its designers to the end goal. But don't just take my word for it, listen to the words of Doug Chang for yourself.
And I was really lucky to have George as my instructor. George has an incredibly keen eye and exquisite taste in art and design. But he didn't teach me how to draw. He taught me how to design. I often hear today in a lot of our art review meetings, well, that's Star Wars or that's not Star Wars. And it's always interesting to hear what other people think is Star Wars. George taught me that Star Wars design is about bold design. Think about the original TIE Fighter, or Slave One, or even the Cloud Cars. It's easy to forget that George took a lot of risks. If you were to, for example, only look at the designs from Episode 4, you wouldn't have designed Cloud City, or the AT-ATs, or even Jabba's barge. And yet, all those designs are distinctly Star Wars. They were unexpected, they were fresh, and they were bold statements at that time. And I also learned, what is Star Wars is what George says is Star Wars.
Lucas was a man of vision limited by the physical constraints of his time, to the point where he often pioneered new technology or film techniques to tell his stories. He was never happy with the end result, and while that would have driven the production staff mad at the time, the end result speaks for itself. Everyone that worked on the original 6 films strived to be the best in the business, to overcome the physical and technical limitations in order to bring George's vision to the big screen. Without that creative vision for Star Wars, and the pioneering spirit, and the often insurmountable challenges to overcome, everything created by Disney falls flat. This list of problems with Disney Star Wars is by no means exhaustive, but they are points that are on full display in The Acolyte. Oh, speaking of being on full display, I almost forgot. Have you ever watched a scene in a film that seemed like it was purely there for the writer or director? Like Tarantino doing a shot of tequila off Salma Hayek's foot. Like it was something that they wanted to hear or see and just slipped it in there without any context?
Inside me.
For me, it was this line of dialogue in The Acolyte.
But I'm better company than a droid. And, way more flexible.
Okay, so I put my editor hat on and asked, what is the point of that line? What does it add? What is the point of the scene? And what can I say? I came up empty. Because if it was to sell a potential romance between the two characters, it was a waste after Jackie got triple P'd by the big Sith. Maybe I've just got a dirty mind, but the line literally just feels like something Headland wanted her actress to say. I can't imagine why.
Am I gay? Yes. Well, no, I know you are gay.
Why are you gay?
On the subject of having a dirty mind, I want to talk about another piece of Disney Star Wars hypocrisy, and that is the sexualization of its characters. And no, I'm not about to suggest that Star Wars has always been a bland and sexless brand. In fact, far from it. But what I do find interesting is that the same company that dropped the ban hammer on Slave Leia, despite the clearly displayed consequences of Jabba's actions, are now comfortable over-sexualizing their male characters. Maybe it's a swinging pendulum thing that was inevitable, but again, I find it ironic that Disney Star Wars defenders will screech that Star Wars is for children, and yet at the same time shit in their hands and clap when the sexy Sith goes for a swim. While I could continue to spend time picking barnacles off the shipwreck, I'd rather talk about the more substantial law problems.
My lord, is that legal?
There's no getting around it. The Acolyte is a lawbreaker. And I'm not talking about a minor law faux pas like Darth Vader turning up unannounced for fan service reasons. I'm talking about canon-altering inclusions that detract from the core 6 films. In fact, if I may be so bold, I would say that the law breaking in The Acolyte is just as bad as somehow Palpatine returned, as it directly and negatively affects the story of Anakin Skywalker. Permit me to elaborate. All this starts with the inclusion of the Sith, an idea I'm sure the creators thought they could pull off in isolation of the original 6 films without inadvertently causing irreparable damage. Not unlike J.J. Abrams' decisions in The Rise of Skywalker. But strap in before Headland straps on. The Acolyte is set 100 years before the events of The Phantom Menace, a film in which it is made quite clear that the Sith haven't been around.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
So unless every single Jedi involved in the affairs of the Acolyte die and or forget to archive their reports on the matter, I really don't see how this doesn't break Episode 1's continuum. But hey, I'm a reasonable invertebrate, and I'm creative enough to accept that there was probably Sith around 100 years before the events of Episode 1. After all, Sidious had to have a master, and of course George Lucas had considered this. The Phantom Menace isn't just a cool name for a film, they are the Sith, specifically Darth Sidious. George Lucas wrote the Sith as a presence that is felt and not seen. Or would it be fairer to say that they were seen but not felt?
The dark side clouds everything. Impossible to see. The future is.
Either way, they were discreetly influencing and manipulating the state of the galaxy to better suit their goals, playing chess with the Republic in the darkness to the point of galactic civil war. But when would Darth Sidious know when to make his final move? Perhaps when a child born of the Force arrived, whom is so powerful that he could one day rule the galaxy. A child so unique and identifiable that it would be impossible to play your cards early and ruin your only chance at destroying the Jedi, in turn making your time in the shadows a waste. Almost like the arrival of a chosen one, whose coming was foretold. Perhaps May and Osha are 2 children without a father whom we are led to believe are conceived by the Force. Sound familiar? Ignoring the not-so-subtle homosexual undertones inserted by Headland of the twin mothers for a moment.
Never have I seen such a display of blatant puffery. Never in all my life!
Unless I'm mistaken, I thought the whole point of Anakin's significance was that he was the only child immaculately conceived by the Force, hence the prophecy. This is the core story of Star Wars, the fall and redemption of Anakin Skywalker, whose fall was made possible by Darth Sidious, the Phantom Menace awaiting his arrival. That's why the Sith hadn't been seen for a millennium. It wasn't just because the Jedi were so arrogant they couldn't sense them, it was because they were deliberately hiding and waiting for their chance, waiting for their revenge. By including May and Osha in the Sith story written by Lucas, you subsequently include them in the Skywalker story because the two are intertwined. The Sith and Skywalkers are not separate in the story of George Lucas's Star Wars. Just because George didn't say there wasn't more Force-born babies doesn't mean that there should be. Because if you look at this plot choice in terms of the core Skywalker narrative, it tarnishes the uniqueness of Anakin and by extension his twin children. It also screws up the carefully crafted story of the Sith waiting for their moment to strike. It screws up the prophecy of the Chosen One and why the Jedi were so wary of it, and it retroactively degrades the Skywalker legacy. Now Anakin wasn't the first and he wasn't special because the Acolyte twins precede him. As a prequel, the Acolyte should be taking care not to step on anything that could affect the original films, but instead it sidestepped a pothole only to fall off a f***ing bridge. When creating Star Wars stories that are considered canon, i.e. anything that could remotely affect the original 6 films, nothing should be overlooked. The first questions asked by the story group should be, is this going to screw anything up? Does this affect the story that already exists?
Are we fouling the nest? And if the answer is anything remotely approaching a maybe, then stay the hell away from the core narrative. There is literally an entire galaxy of stories that can be told without going anywhere remotely near the Sith or the Skywalkers.
But it seems the continuity manager at Lucasfilm is paid to do absolutely nothing. I understand that the precedence has already been set by a sequel trilogy that to this day blows my mind could have been greenlit without a plan. A story that should have been about Luke and Leia as the children of the Chosen One that basically ignored them in the first film, degraded and killed one in the second, and then killed the last in the final film. A trilogy that has the nerve to call itself part of the Skywalker saga that concluded by killing off the Skywalker bloodline and having a Palpatine replace them. A trilogy that really had nothing of significance to do with the Skywalkers because it was too busy letting directors play tug of war with what they wanted the character of Rey to be. And a trilogy of films that ultimately ruined the legacy of Anakin Skywalker. So how, after all of that, can you call yourself a Star Wars fan and continue to dump on the story that you say you care about? How can you say it's time to steer away from the Skywalker saga only to place your prequel directly ahead of it, plagiarize and progressify it, and continue to tarnish it? I cannot tell if it's incompetence, indifference, or insidiousness that continues to degrade George's life's work, but I guess that's an appropriate segue to talk about the Acolyte's creator.
That's when I'm gonna get my sex change.
How can they do that, R2? That dreadful man putting his name right next to ours.
And I'll see you guys at the Oscars.
Oh, how did this whole thing start? I really don't know.
He was deceived by a lie. We all were.
Before I go any further, I'm going to say something controversial, but from what I've seen, Leslie Headland is a fan of Star Wars.
This is outrageous. I object to the Senator's statements.
That doesn't mean she was the right person to direct a Star Wars show, particularly a prequel, but I will not have it said that the Working Jellyfish does not give a fair shake of the sauce bottle. Leslie has a Princess Leia tattoo on her hand. She wrote Star Wars fan fiction as a teenager and has played Knights of the Old Republic more than once. She can also readily reference Star Wars quotes in her interviews. These facts alone demonstrate that she is more of a fan than others we've seen take a crack at our beloved franchise. While I'm not excusing her work, I also won't entertain the argument that she's not a fan, because clearly that is not the case. Evidently, she is just very selective about the elements of Star Wars that are important to her. A bit like how some still won't accept the prequels as canon, or how others, myself included, can't accept the Disney sequels as successors to Lucas's work. But I will hear no more of this "she's not a real fan" nonsense. She's a fan just like you or I. The difference, though, is her fanfiction is now a canon reality, regardless of its quality, unlike yours or mine. Regardless, Headland was handpicked by Kathleen Kennedy, the president of Lucasfilm, to be the first openly gay director to write a Star Wars project. Why is her sexual orientation relevant to the discussion? Well, namely because Lucasfilm made it a talking point, but also, as seen in the clip from George Lucas, personal life experience is a central ingredient in someone's creativity. And whether intentional or otherwise, your biases will bleed through into your work, and Headland is no exception.
The galaxy is not a place that welcomes women like us.
What do you mean?
It's also relevant to mention that Headland was a former assistant of Harvey Weinstein, not to dunk on her, but to provide context into her creative decisions. I really don't feel like discussing Weinstein in too much detail lest I get sued for defamation, but let's just say the man is not held in high esteem with reference to his interactions of the young women of Hollywood. A fact not lost on Headland, who went as far as to produce a play indirectly citing the ordeal she underwent as his assistant. While the details surrounding Headland's time under Weinstein... Wait, that phrasing is bad. While the details surrounding Headland's time as the personal assistant to Mr. Weinstein, who saw nothing untoward happen to the women working at Miramax, are not clear... Good. Despite Headland's deflections in the various interviews she's conducted, it's hard to deny that her personal experiences aren't on full display in The Acolyte, as we've already seen from a couple of choice clips. This in itself is not necessarily a problem. After all, George Lucas used Star Wars as a vehicle to explore the issues of the modern world in a fantastical setting long ago. And no writer is ever truly capable of omitting themselves from their work in whatever capacity. The difference, though, is intent, implementation, and ideology. Lucas was intent on recreating the modern hero's myth, a tried and tested tale as old as storytelling itself for a new generation lost in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the post-Watergate scandal. In the 1970s, Hollywood was dominated by downbeat realism, and George sought to uplift his audience out of their film-going depression. He did this by creating a galaxy of clearly defined good and evil, where audiences knew who to cheer and who to fear. An elegantly simple story for a more civilized age.
Success is that it's a positive film, it has heroes and villains, and that it essentially is a fun movie to watch. It's been a long time since people have been able to go to the movies and see a sort of straightforward, wholesome, fun adventure.
A movie that ultimately left the audience feeling uplifted at its end, whether that was A New Hope in isolation or the trilogy complete. It should go without saying, but I'll hammer the point anyway because many seem to have forgotten that Star Wars was George Lucas's creation, and he was therefore free to do with it as he pleased. George has often been accused of being childish in his filmmaking, from the time A New Hope premiered all the way through to his work on the Clone Wars just before he retired. But I would offer that George was never truly childish, he merely maintained a childlike sense of idealism and innocence with his work on Star Wars, crafting simple, universal messages that would withstand the test of time. I suspect this is why many older fans hated the prequels, because unlike George, the world had already beaten them down by the time Episode 1 premiered. I recently rewatched Episode 1, and I still bloody love it. People that hate The Phantom Menace were the same type of children that told others there was no Santa Claus. People that had lost touch with their inner child, and rather than reconciling that, they chose to kill the joy for others. Enter Leslie Headland, a woman that spent much of her early life unhappy because she always felt different. A woman who had to hide her sexuality from Christian parents because their faith did not approve of her sexual orientation. A woman who, when striking out on her own, came to work for a man that used his position of power to abuse women. A woman whose life experiences were unfairly scarred by factors outside of her control, who eventually became a director. So at least from my perspective, I am not surprised that she has sought to deconstruct the Jedi and the Acolyte. After all, they very much represent the elements that have cast a shadow over the whole of her life. A religious order that understand the Force in terms of binary opposites, outcasting what is other or different. That's High Council and principal characters are primarily strong male characters that seek to use their power to enforce order on chaos, whom from a deconstructive postmodernist point of view could be seen as colonizers, imperialists, or dogmatic zealots. So it's not difficult to envision why she would take issue with such an order, whether consciously or otherwise, despite their ultimate mission being peace and justice throughout the galaxy, in spite of the given political turmoil of the day. A mission that ultimately survived the execution of their order, reignited the compassion of a fallen hero, and conquered the very evil that sought to undo it because of a father's compassion and love for his son. An idea that speaks to the very core of human existence and that could inspire children the world over to say, "May the Force be with you," regardless of their sex, race, colour or creed. But that's kind of my point. Lucas was able to rise above the troubles of his time and create something truly uplifting. A timeless story not only in terms of the aesthetics that could age his films, but also in terms of the message it sought to deliver, choosing optimism and hope when he could have easily let life get him down and let that be reflected in his work.
Why do you think that?
I mean that George Lucas was at the height of his creative powers after Return of the Jedi, and had all of Hollywood bowing before him. He could have literally chosen to do anything that he wanted, only to learn that he couldn't have children with his then wife, to subsequently learn that that wife had cheated on him, to then be divorced from her, only to have her take half his money, leaving him alone to raise a newly adopted daughter. But instead of doing a Spielberg and creating a film whose leading lady was depicted as a useless screaming damsel, he created Queen Amidala.
Will not condone a course of action that will lead us to war.
Ooh, she's so powerful. Okay, I'm twisting time and history to my advantage a little bit there, but I'm sure you can see my point. George always innately understood that his work was bigger than himself, and thus never used it for self-gratification or personal catharsis. And I salute him. Good on you, George Lucas, you bloody legend. Headland, on the other hand, is just more of the same, a product of her time. Another creator using Star Wars as a vehicle to air her unresolved personal hang-ups at the expense of Lucas's work, turning the Jedi into a clumsy allegory for modern-day law enforcement.
Stop! In the name of the Republic and the Jedi Order! Step away from the body. Lay down any weapons that you have and surrender.
You're under arrest.
As well as deriding them for their religious undertones, while unironically idolising a cult of witches with questionable moral compasses. And personally, I'm sick of it. Star Wars was once so much more than mediocre sci-fi for the streaming generation. It was more than the sum of its parts, not only in terms of what Lucas achieved technically in order to create his films, but in terms of how it galvanised people to be hopeful, idealist and kind. Disney Star Wars, and the Acolyte specifically, are postmodernist leeches that seek to tear down what once was to make themselves feel relevant and important, because they are incapable of creating anything original or even remotely comparable to what Star Wars once was. But you know what they say, evil cannot create anything new, they can only corrupt and ruin what good forces have invented or made. Which includes twisting the moralities of George Lucas's clearly defined good and evil to be something more digestible to this quote-unquote modern audience. Which is ironic because Disney wouldn't know what morally right looked like if it smacked him in the face. But if I was to be a bit meta, I would say that Leslie Headland's opinion of the Jedi can be summed up in this little speech.
I think the Jedi are a massive system of unchecked power, posing as a religion. A delusional cult that claims to control the uncontrollable.
We don't control the Force.
Not the Force. Your emotions. You project an image of goodness and restraint. But it's only a matter of time before one of you snaps. And when, not if that happens, who will be strong enough to stop him? The majority of my colleagues can't imagine a galaxy without the Jedi. And I can understand why. When you're looking up to heroes, you don't have to face what's right in front of you.
Interesting that the senator should choose to say him rather than she or them, but that's personal bias for you. And if you need further proof that Leslie simply doesn't understand the Jedi, as we watch them float around like Marvel superheroes, I'll call again upon the wise words of George Lucas.
Jedi are like negotiators. They aren't people that go out and blow up planets. They aren't people that shoot down things. They're more of a one-to-one combat type. So I just want the form of fighting and the role of the Jedi Knight to be special and more spiritual and more intellectual than just a fighter or a superhero or something like that.
So, as you may have gathered, in the opinion of this jellyfish, the Acolyte is not a fine addition. In fact, quite the opposite. It is a reductionist mess of corporately produced fan fiction, clutching desperately to a sinking corpse of a franchise that once redefined how films were made. Piggybacking off the success of a far more talented creator, as it dares to stand at the front of the Star Wars timeline while simultaneously and shamefully tearing down the legacy of George Lucas's stories that made this abomination of a show possible in the first place. Brought to you by a selfish creator more interested in self-indulging her ego as she used Star Wars as a vehicle for pseudo-intellectual catharsis. Enabled by a president that is seemingly more determined than ever to destroy the franchise that she was gifted that George Lucas worked so hard to build. But I am aware that I am approaching something of an ironic conclusion if I do nothing but tear down the Acolyte without offering an alternative. So here it is.
I mean, you got the dark side, the light side. One is selfless, one is selfish. And you want to keep them in balance. What happens when you go to the dark side is it goes out of balance and then you get really selfish and you forget about everybody and you ultimately lead yourself, because when you get selfish, you get stuff, or you want stuff. And when you want stuff and you get stuff, then you are afraid somebody's going to take it away from you. Whether it's a person or a thing or a particular pleasure, experience. Once you become afraid that somebody's going to take it away from you, or you're going to lose it, then you start to become angry, especially if you're losing it. And that anger leads to hate. And hate leads to suffering. Mostly on the part of the person who's selfish, because you spend all your time being afraid of losing everything you've got, instead of actually living. Where joy, by giving to other people, you can't think about yourself, and therefore there's no pain. But the pleasure factor of greed and of selfishness is a short-lived experience. Therefore, you're constantly trying to replenish it. But of course, the more you replenish it, the harder it is to, so you have to keep upping the ante. You're actually afraid of the pain of not having the joy. So that is ultimately the core of the whole dark side, light side of the Force.
And if you go to the side of light, you will be happy. Because compassion, helping other people, not thinking about yourself, thinking about others, that gives you a joy that you can't get any other way. Being selfish, following your pleasures, always entertaining yourself with pleasure and buying things and doing stuff, you're always going to be unhappy. You'll never get to the point. You get this little instant shot of pleasure, but it goes away, and then you're stuck where you were before. And the more you do it, the worse it gets. You finally get everything you want, and you're miserable because there's nothing at the end of that road. Whereas if you are compassionate and you get to the end of the road, you've helped so many people. I mean, you know, some of the speakers have gotten up here. When you think about the thousands of people you may have helped, you may have stopped from suffering and everything, that gives you a very warm feeling. Anyway, I've gone way over my time, but thank you very much.
Be vocal about Star Wars, because if you don't, the saga will continue on its downward trajectory. Highlight the parts that you love, but also call out the points that you don't, and why. Be respectful in your criticism, but don't be afraid to call out bullshit when you smell it. But most importantly, remember that even a brainless lump, who is likely floating in a sea of what must be mostly his own tears at this point, knows that no matter how far one has fallen, only compassion can bring them back from the dark side. Hooroo, mate.